Hey everyone, welcome. If we haven't met before, I'm Rebecca Pickens. I'm a certified book coach and developmental editor and host of Self-Editing Essentials, a group coaching program for fiction and memoir writers. Today, we are going to talk all about first-person point of view, the pros, the cons, when to use it, when to skip it. A fiction writer begins a new project. One of the first things that they think about, usually, is point of view. This is also something that comes up if you're in the revision process where suddenly you realize certain things about the story just aren't really coming together. This is another time when you might want to think about point of view. First person point of view, really simply defined, is how a story is told through the I, me, or my pronoun. It's really easy to spot a story that's written this way. In first person point of view, the narrator is part of the story that's being told. We think about first person point of view coming under two categories. The first is first person central. And that's an instance in which the protagonist, the person who your story is primarily focused on, that person is the narrator. That's probably the most common form of first person point of view. You can think about characters like Holden Caulfield in Catcher in the Rye, who is telling his own story and really bringing us up real close into his world. The second kind of first person point of view that we see a little less often, but that also is very effective, is first person peripheral. In this instance, the narrator is still a part of the story, still probably a very important part of the story, even, but they aren't the protagonist. Perfect example of this is Watson in Sherlock Holmes. While he is a central figure, Holmes is, of course, the protagonist of the story, but we hear all of the stories about Sherlock filtered through the eyes of Watson. So why does point of view matter so much? You can think of point of view as a movie camera that's shining a light on different scenes, different perspectives, and telling the reader where to look, showing them what is most important. So, in doing so, point of view is shaping your reader's experience of the characters that you're writing about. It's determining the level of intimacy your readers will feel. It's also a great way to play with narrative tension. Depending on what point of view you're using, we're going to experience the tension your story contains in different kinds of ways. And also, point of view determines what kind of information we can know about as readers. First person is a very powerful perspective, but it is limiting in some ways, including what kind of information we can make available to the reader. So let's look first at some of the pros of using the first person point of view. I mentioned deep emotional intimacy. This is probably the number one reason that people like to use first person point of view. We are getting direct access into the thoughts of your narrator. We know what they think, what they believe, what they feel. We are finding out in real time how they're responding to the things that are happening around them. So we have this real propulsive immediacy that comes with this point of view. In other words, your point of view, when you use first person point of view, you are going to ensure that your readers feel close to your character. It's especially effective for stories that we sort of think of as quieter stories, that is, character-driven novels, books that focus a lot on psychological development and evolution of your characters. Another reason that people really gravitate toward first person point of view is because of the ability to play with voice. If you have ever been told that you're a very voicey writer and that your characters really come on alive on the page because of the way they speak, this might be the POV you want to play with. In this instance, voice is the engine of your story. It allows for you to play with idiosyncratic language. In other words, things that only your character would say that make them really unique, maybe a little quirky or a little extra serious. You can play with voice in this point of view in a very unique, very immediate sort of way. First person point of view is also a way to exhibit bias and attitude that your character may hold. It's a way to play with humor and irony. Of course, you can do these things with other points of view, but they come across in a very singular sort of way when you're in first person point of view. You will probably agree that some of the most memorable characters that you have read are in first person point of view novels, simply because we get to know them. They become our friend or they become our nemesis in a way that is wholly unique to the first person point of view. Another pro of using this point of view is natural subjectivity. And what I mean about that is your narrator, if it's first person point of view, does not need to be objective. They can be unreliable if that's something you choose to do. They can misrepresent information. They can have blind spots that they just don't understand in themselves. This is really ideal if you're doing some kind of a really deep character study of a flawed character. Sometimes it works well if you're doing a thriller or a crime novel because, again, that unreliable narrator can be really interesting to try to figure out. Stories about self-deception and also about growth and evolution work really well because of this natural subjectivity you can play with. So now let's consider some of the situations in which first-person point of view is not optimal. Remember, we've got lots of other kinds of point of view we can play with later on. Challenges of first person point of view that does discourage some writers from using it is that limited knowledge that the character who is narrating the story can provide. The narrator can only report on what they witness or what they were told or what they are inferring in a scene, which means that you lose some of that depth about some of the other characters in the story and even sometimes about your first person point of view narrator because they don't necessarily understand everything about the way that they are interpreting a situation. So it can be much more difficult to show offstage events that are happening. We lose touch with the inner lives of some of the other characters in your story. And sometimes this is a sacrifice that just feels too great. And then people opt not to engage with this point of view for that reason. There's also a risk of overtelling. There can be a temptation to explain every single thought or feeling that first person narrator is experiencing. There can be a lot of navel gazing, excessive introspection that can grow tiresome. There may be a repetition of emotional states because you're so with that one narrator that they may not be able to resist telling the reader everything about what they're feeling. And that can get tiresome. That can get difficult to navigate. It also just requires a very strong discipline in terms of balancing, showing, and telling. There is a tendency in this point of view when you're working on an early draft to have a lot more telling. And that's simply because you're in the head of this character so deeply that there is just this sort of natural inclination to tell. Now, that can all be smoothed out during revisions, but it is something that can be off-putting to some writers. Because the narrator's voice is always present, you run the risk of readers disengaging with it if it's too flat or whiny, overly self-focused, even sometimes if your character is really funny and maybe a little bit sarcastic, and that's fun in small doses, it can become overbearing if not handled delicately in a first-person point of view. So thinking about voice fatigue, putting yourself in the shoes of your reader and considering whether this voice is one that can sustain an entire novel. There are structural constraints. We've talked a little bit about this already. It can be more difficult to establish suspense because the narrator has clearly survived everything. So there's no big question mark. Outcomes can feel a little bit predetermined as a result, and timeline manipulation is going to require extra care. It really depends on the kind of story that you're working on, but you want to consider what is it that you need to reveal? What is it that you need to hold back from the reader in order for your structure to really gel? So that's another component to consider when you're thinking about POV. Now, let's talk about when first person works best, because there are many instances when this is the case. When you are telling a story that is focused on identity, transformation of your character, or some really complicated moral conflict with a single character that we really want to dig into and understand from lots of different angles, this can be a perfect POV to do this kind of deep work. When your narrator has a strong voice that can sustain itself for an entire story, when the emotional stakes are really high for a particular character, and you really want your reader to empathize with that character. Again, thinking about that Holden Caulfield character, we care about him much more because although he's a difficult guy, he's kind of a distasteful character, we're so in his head that we begin to experience the same emotional stakes that he does. And when you have a character who has something very significant to learn or to lose, sometimes hearing that from their perspective delivers an extra impact. There are times when we want to reconsider first person. You've already seen some examples. Other examples are when you have a very large ensemble cast. Now, we're seeing more and more where first person point of view alternates between different chapters in instances where we have a lot of compelling characters and we really want to bring our readers close to them. So, a large ensemble cast does not determine that you absolutely positively can't use first person point of view, but it does just gives you some extra things to consider. When we're doing complex political or world building plots, sometimes first person point of view is just too limited because there's so much we need to understand about the workings of this world. And sometimes readers will feel a little robbed if they don't have all of that information. That tends to be why they enjoy books like those. They want that complexity and they want to see everything. Stories where the protagonist lacks self-awareness or urgency can also be a difficult place to use this point of view. If you have a character who's particularly passive, these can be fascinating characters to explore, but sometimes your storytelling will just be a little too quiet if your character is super passive. And while an unreliable narrator can be a lot of fun to write and read, it's not always what your intention is. So if you have a character who is out of touch with what's going on and is particularly unreliable, it may not be that you want to you may not be that you want to limit the options that a more omniscient narrator could provide. So now for your key craft question. That is the question that you're going to ask yourself to decide, is this the right POV for me? Is the most interesting part of the story the narrator's internal experience, or is it the world around them? If your answer is their internal experience, I think you could have a lot of fun and a lot of success writing in first person point of view. But really, it has so much more to do with what's going to make you most comfortable and with the particulars of the story you want to tell. So for a little extra practice here, you might want to try this exercise. Try rewriting a scene you're currently working on. Write it in first person and write it in third person. Notice what becomes sharper and what also disappears. This is going to give you a really good idea of what you're willing to sacrifice for your particular point of view and what is just absolutely a non-negotiable. In my next video, I am going to be talking about the pros and cons of third person point of view. So please check it out when you have a chance. Finally, I want to invite you to Story Circle, my free weekly writing session where writers come together from my community and work together for an hour, on camera, off camera, whatever's most comfortable to you. It's a super casual, very inviting space, and I would love to see you there. If you'd like to learn more about this free writing sprint, you can get a link in the comments section. All right, everyone, happy writing.